The day David Crane was escorted from the building, you were at your desk on floor 7 of the Meridian Urban Planning building, and you were doing what you had been doing for 38 months, which was working. Not because the work required it at that particular moment, because you had learned a long time before this Thursday that the safest response to everything happening around you was to make the work undeniable. You heard David's voice before you heard anything else, coming from the direction of the elevators at the far end of the floor corridor, louder than normal and carrying the particular confusion that comes when a person's reality has rearranged itself faster than their understanding can keep up with. Security arrived with 2 people, not 1, which you noted without looking up from your screen. They collected his badge at 2:47 p.m. You know the time because your computer screen had the clock in the corner, and because you have replayed that specific number in your mind many times since, not with satisfaction, which would have been too easy, but with something that was closer to a very quiet recognition that the record had finally corrected itself. His assistant Melissa came by 10 minutes after the badge collection. She had a wheeled black bag, the kind people use for airports. It was clearly packed before she arrived that morning, which tells you something about the quality of information that moved through that office's informal networks. She did not look at anyone as she cleared her desk outside his office. She was precise and fast in the way that people are precise and fast when they know they are being watched and want to appear to be thinking about something else. You said nothing. You did not look up. You had spent 38 months building every significant asset in that company's portfolio, and you had spent the 6 months before this Thursday making absolutely certain that anyone with authority would be able to see exactly who had done the building. This is that story. Let's go back to March. Not 3 years back, all the way back to the March when you accepted the senior project manager position at Meridian Urban Planning Group and drove into the underground parking structure on Lakeview Drive for the first time with a temporary visitor badge that you wore clipped to the outside of your jacket because you did not yet know that almost everyone at Meridian kept their badge in their pocket. You learned that in the first week. You learned a lot of things in the first month, some of them significant and some of them not, and part of what this story is about is the ones that seemed insignificant at the time and were not. Meridian Urban Planning Group was a 31-person firm that had been operating for 22 years under the founding partnership of Kenneth Haig and Susan Park. Kenneth had started it with borrowed money and a reputation from 7 years at a large municipal planning department, and the firm's early identity was built on exactly that reputation: disciplined public sector experience, a real understanding of how city governments actually made decisions, and a refusal to take on more work than the team could execute at a high standard. 22 years later, the firm was stable rather than glamorous. It occupied 2 floors of an 8-story building, employed 31 people, and had a client list that was heavily weighted toward public and quasi-public work, infrastructure projects, community development plans, waterfront revitalization studies, and the kind of work that comes from sustained relationships with municipal planning departments rather than from aggressive business development. It was the kind of firm where people tended to stay. The average tenure when you joined was 11 years, which in a planning consultancy of this size was unusual enough that you had asked about it in your interview. Kenneth Haig had said simply that he hired people who understood the work and then he trusted them to do it. That answer had been part of why you took the job. You had spent 8 years at 2 other firms where trust was a conditional resource and understanding the work was a lower priority than appearing to understand the work. You were ready for a place where the work was the point. You had spent those 8 years developing a specific earned expertise in municipal infrastructure project management. You knew the funding structures that governments use for large capital projects of federal and state grant programs with their particular application cycles and eligibility criteria, the community consultation frameworks that actually generated usable input versus the ones that performed engagement without achieving it. You knew how to write a project scope that a regulator would approve on the first submission because you had learned expensively through experience what happened when they did not. You knew how environmental assessment processes worked and how to identify when one had been scoped incorrectly early enough to fix it before it became a schedule problem. You knew, in short, the difference between planning work that was technically adequate and planning work that actually got built. That difference was the thing you had been developing for 8 years, and it was the thing you brought to Meridian on a March morning when you walked into the building with a visitor badge on your jacket and a clear picture of what you wanted to do with the next phase of your career. Your director was David Crane. He had the office at the end of the floor 7 corridor, the one with the window that faced the street rather than the parking structure, and he had held that office for 11 of his 12 years at Meridian. He was tall in the way that carries weight in client meetings before a word has been spoken, and he had a quality of professional composure that read well in rooms full of municipal officials and city councilors who were trying to determine whether the people they were hiring were going to show up at a public meeting and embarrass them. He was fast with email, his desk was always clear, his calendar was full. These are the signals that read as competence from a distance, and from a distance over the first 4 weeks, you read them as competence. What you could not see from a distance was what the competence was actually organized around. David Crane was an excellent manager of other people's work. He understood how to present it, how to narrate it, how to position it in a room in a way that made people feel it was his thinking, his vision, his professional intelligence at work. What he was less capable of was generating the work itself. This was not a character failing in the way that makes for a satisfying story. It was a structural fact about what David was actually good at versus what his position required him to appear good at. He had survived 11 years at Meridian by surrounding himself with people who could do the work and building a system around himself that ensured the credit moved upward. You did not learn this in the first month. You learned it across the first year through the accumulation of 100 small observations that seemed individually explainable and only became a pattern when you held them together. The first time you noticed something, you let it pass. The second time, you told yourself it was a style difference. The third time, you started to understand what you were inside of, and by then you were deep enough into the Riverwalk project that leaving would have meant abandoning the best work of your career at the moment it was beginning to become visible. The Riverwalk redevelopment project had been sitting in a pre-planning stage at Meridian for 4 months when you arrived. The project was a $47 million mixed-use urban renewal initiative along a 2-kilometer stretch of the city's downtown riverfront corridor, a part of the city that had been actively blighted for nearly 15 years and that the municipal government had been trying to revitalize through a series of plans that had each stalled at different points in the process. 3 previous proposals had failed. 2 had failed at the community consultation phase because they had not adequately accounted for the distinct character of the 3 neighborhood associations whose territories bordered the corridor. 1 had failed at the funding application stage because the scope had been written in a way that misaligned with the federal infrastructure grant criteria in effect at the time of application. The city was now trying again, this time with a higher budget, a more complex funding model that blended federal grants with city capital budget and private developer participation, and a requirement that the consulting team deliver something that could actually survive the scrutiny of a council with a long institutional memory of the previous failures. Meridian had won the contract based on Kenneth Haig's relationship with the city's chief planner, a relationship built over 2 decades, and on a proposal that had David Crane's name on the cover. David handed you the project file at the end of your 3rd week. He said, "This is the work that's going to define this firm for the next 10 years. You're going to be the architect of this whole thing." He said it casually, which you remember clearly because people who are about to hand you the most demanding project of their career usually say something with more weight to it. He turned back to his desk after saying it, which told you that in his mental model of the transaction that had just occurred, the critical part was complete. You carried the 3-inch project binder back to your desk and started reading. By the time you finished reading, it was 9:45 p.m. and the office was empty, and you had already identified 5 structural problems with the project setup that would need to be resolved before any deliverable could be credibly produced. You started on the first one the following morning. Over the next 3 months, you built the Riverwalk project from its conceptual bones into a functioning, deliverable-capable project operation. You rewrote the Phase 2 environmental assessment scope because the version in the binder would have failed the municipal review for misalignment with the current environmental assessment regulations, which had been updated 18 months earlier. The existing scope had been drafted before the update and no one had caught it. You rebuilt the community consultation framework. The previous plan had divided the three neighborhood associations into a single undifferentiated stakeholder group, which was the kind of approach that generates protest at public meetings rather than constructive input. You researched all three associations separately, contacted their chairs in advance of the first formal consultation, learned what each group's specific concerns were about the corridor, and designed a consultation process with distinct tracks for each group that could then be synthesized into a coherent public record. This took 6 weeks. You then built the funding model, which meant cross-referencing the federal infrastructure grant criteria against every element of the project scope and rewriting the scope elements that did not align, then modeling the private developer contribution structure across 3 different investor scenarios to make sure the project remained financially viable if the private component underperformed. This took 3 weeks of evenings. Then you wrote the grant application, which was 72 pages and which you completed on a Sunday afternoon in April while eating takeout at your kitchen table because the deadline was the following Wednesday and the client had not been able to provide a final project description until the previous Thursday. The application came back approved, full federal funding on the first submission. Meridian had never achieved this on a first submission for a project of this size. Kenneth Haig came into David Crane's office the morning the approval letter arrived. You heard the conversation through the open door 12 feet from your desk. Kenneth said, "David, this is extraordinary. You should be proud." David said he was. He used the word "we" once, which you remember because it was the only time you heard your contribution acknowledged in any form in that exchange, and it was buried inside a sentence that was primarily about David's relief that the application had succeeded. You did not walk into David's office afterward. You did not go to Kenneth and explain the reality. Part of this was that you did not yet understand the full dimensions of what was happening. Part of it was that you had spent 8 years in firms where project managers did not go to principals and say, "I want credit for the application." That was not how the culture worked. You trusted that visible, sustained output over time would establish the record more credibly than any single conversation. You were working from a model of how organizations allocate credit that turned out not to apply to this particular organization because this particular organization had David Crane in a structural position where the natural flow of credit always moved through him before reaching anyone with authority to act on it. The first time you noticed something that you could not explain away was a Thursday in June, the year you joined. David had presented the Phase 1 progress report to Meridian's senior leadership team. You had written that report over 4 days. You had organized the underlying data, developed the analytical framework, written all the narrative content, and produced the graphics. You had formatted it according to Meridian's client deliverable template, added your name to the author field in the document properties, and submitted it to David for review on the Monday before the Thursday presentation. David sent it back the following day with 2 changes. He had adjusted the font size in one table header. He had added his name to the cover page in the primary author position and moved your name to a secondary field labeled Project Management rather than the author attribution. You noticed this. You told yourself it was normal. Director's name on cover documents, standard industry practice. You changed nothing. At the Thursday meeting, Kenneth said, "David, this is an excellent piece of work. Very thorough analysis." David said thank you and said the team had done well. He did not name you. Kenneth nodded. Susan Park nodded. Martin Foles, the CFO, wrote something in his notebook. You were 3 seats down the table, the author of the document being praised, and your name had not been spoken once. You told yourself it was fine. Senior people often get the credit in client-facing settings. This was an internal meeting, but still, the pattern would correct itself. The pattern did not correct itself. The pattern intensified. In September of your first year, you produced what you later considered the most technically significant single document of your career to that point. The milestone report for the Riverwalk Phase 3 was a 48-page analysis that identified a scheduling conflict between the heritage designation review process and the construction tender timeline that, if not resolved, would cost the project 8 weeks in delays and approximately $340,000 in carrying charges. The conflict was not visible in the project schedule because it existed at the intersection of two processes managed by two different municipal bodies, each of which assumed the other's timeline was fixed. It took you 11 days to identify it, model it, and develop 3 resolution options with their respective costs and schedule implications. The document you produced included a recommended resolution path that would ultimately be adopted by the city project team, and that would save the project the 8 weeks and the $340,000. This document was presented to the city's project oversight committee with David Crane's name on the cover and was referenced in the committee minutes as Director Crane's analysis. The city's project director sent David a personal note of thanks. David forwarded it to Kenneth. You were not mentioned in the note or in the forwarding message. In February of your second year, the federal funding application's approval was publicly announced by the city at a press briefing. The Meridian firm was named as the consultant. David Crane was named as the principal. There was a photograph in a regional planning journal the following month. David standing with the city's chief planner in front of the Riverside site. The caption listed him as the lead consultant. You read the caption on a Wednesday morning and felt something that was not anger exactly. It was more specific than anger. It was the feeling of watching a record be written about a thing you actually did and finding that the record contains someone else's name where yours should be. It is a very particular feeling. If you have experienced it, you will recognize exactly what I mean. You started keeping notes in April of your second year. Not formal documentation, not yet. Draft email in your personal account that you never sent, a running record of incidents with date and brief description because you had begun to understand that your instincts were not wrong and that if you were ever going to act on any of this you needed to be able to describe it with specificity rather than with feeling. The draft email grew, 14 entries by the end of April, 27 by June, 41 by the end of that year. 41 separate instances in 9 months in which your work was attributed incorrectly. You looked at that number sometimes and felt the weight of how long you had been watching this without doing anything about it, and then you looked at the work itself, at the project that was taking shape on the city's riverfront because of what you had built, and you stayed. Melissa Park had been David's assistant for 6 years when you arrived, and she was the second person whose role in the operation you came to understand only gradually. In the first months, Melissa was simply efficient. She managed David's calendar, his correspondence, his travel arrangements, and the administrative architecture that kept the office running at the surface level. She was pleasant and organized and professional in every interaction you had with her. It was only in the second year that you began to understand that her organizational function extended to the project files in the shared drive. At Meridian, all project deliverables were saved to a shared network drive that was organized by project and accessible to all staff. When documents were submitted for client delivery or for the firm's internal record, Melissa organized the final versions on the shared drive and archived the working drafts. This meant Melissa controlled the metadata architecture of the shared drive. She controlled how files were named, what author information was preserved in the file properties, and what folder structure they lived in. You discovered the first specific instance in the autumn of your second year when you went looking for the Phase 2 environmental assessment that you had rewritten in your first month. You needed to reference a specific analytical note you had written in the scope rewrite for a new piece of work that had a similar regulatory context. The document was on the shared drive under a folder called D. Crane Development Files with a file name that included David's name in the title and listed him as the primary author in the document properties. You still had the original file on your personal laptop. You opened it. Your name was in the author field. The document metadata showed it had been created by your computer account. The shared drive version had David's name in the author field and showed its creation through David's account, even though it was obviously the same document with the same analytical framework and the same written content. Someone had opened your original file, changed the metadata, and saved a copy to the shared drive under David's name. You saved both versions. You added a new entry to your draft email. You did not go to David. You did not go to Melissa. You went home and thought about it for a week before deciding what to do next, and what you decided was that the information you had was not yet sufficient. You needed more before any of it would be meaningful to anyone else. The decision to go to HR came from a place of genuine belief that the internal system would function as intended. You had been in organizations before where HR had been effective, where a serious professional concern raised in good faith had been handled with the seriousness it deserved. You went to Robert Finch in late autumn of your second year because you believed that was the appropriate channel and because you had been watching the problem accumulate for long enough that you needed the institution to start being aware of it. Robert Finch was a trim, quiet man in his mid-50s who had been HR director at Meridian for 8 years and who listened to everything you said with a quality of attention that you initially interpreted as engagement. You were careful in that meeting. You used professional language. You described what you had been observing without editorializing. You said attribution and visibility and that making sure the record reflects contributions accurately. You did not say theft. You were measured. Robert nodded in several places. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which were about process rather than substance. He said he understood your concern. He said attribution of professional contributions was an important matter. He said he would keep an eye on the situation. He said this with the particular verbal texture of a person who is performing attentiveness without intending to act. You recognized it, but you had made the meeting and you had said the thing, and now it was in the institution's awareness, which you believed would matter. You had not yet left the building when Robert Finch walked the 2 doors down the corridor to David Crane's office. You know this because you were still in the lobby on the ground floor, waiting for an elevator that was slow, and you could see from the lobby window the light in David's office change as his door opened and a silhouette moved through it, which would have been nothing except that 3 minutes later your phone received an email from David about your formatting approach on the current project report, written in a style that was noticeably colder and more prescriptive than his previous communications. The email had been composed and sent while you were in the elevator. Robert Finch had walked into David's office before you left the building, and David had responded to that information within minutes. You went home and wrote the most detailed entry your draft email had yet contained. You described the HR meeting, Robert's language, the timing of David's email, the 15-minute window between your leaving Robert's office and David's response. You described what it meant, which was that Robert Finch was not functioning as a neutral institutional resource. He was functioning as a relay point. You now had a director who was taking your work, an assistant who was managing the document trail to conceal it, and an HR director who was providing early warning to the director when the process the director was abusing was invoked. The cage had 3 walls and you had just found all 3 of them in the same afternoon. David Crane's behavior toward you changed after the Robert Finch meeting. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been immediately visible to anyone watching from the outside, but in the specific ways that a person in a position of authority deploys against someone they now consider a threat rather than a resource. The project meetings that had previously included you were gradually restructured. The client-facing meetings stayed because you were essential to their content, but the internal senior team discussions where strategic project decisions were made began to be held without you and reported back afterward. Your office was moved. Not far, just relocated from a desk with a window view to one adjacent to the photocopy room, which produced a constant low-level noise and which was explained as a space reorganization. Your name was removed from the firm's project team page on the website for the Riverwalk project. When you raised this with Melissa, she said it had been a website update error and she would fix it. It was not fixed. It was not fixed. In your 3rd annual review, David noted your technical contributions positively but added a section about communication style and alignment with team direction that had not appeared in your previous 2 reviews and for which no specific incidents were cited. You read that review section carefully. You documented it that evening with the date and the full text. By April of your 3rd year, you had been watching this for 24 months and documenting it informally for 12. The draft email had 68 entries. The Riverwalk project was now in its final phase, approaching delivery. The work was almost complete. The city was preparing for the first public announcement of the riverfront transformation, and every public record of that transformation had David Crane's name on it. The morning of April 9th arrived on a Tuesday. You had parked in the underground structure at 7:28 a.m., which was your normal time, and you were sitting in your car with your phone reading the week's planning industry updates the way you often did in those 7 minutes between arriving and going upstairs. On that morning, the Regional Planning Conference's speaker program had been published online. David Crane was listed as a keynote speaker. The event description gave his biography. The biography listed him as the lead architect and principal designer of the Riverwalk redevelopment project. It described the project in accurate detail. It described the environmental assessment rewrite you had done. It described the community consultation framework you had designed. It described the funding model you had built. It described all of it as David's work. You sat in your car for 11 minutes. The biography had been submitted by Meridian's communications team based on information David had provided to them. This was not a misunderstanding or an administrative oversight. This was a deliberate act of attribution presented to the professional community in a public-facing forum claiming authorship of work that you had done. You looked at the biography for a long time. Then you put your phone in your bag, went upstairs, and sat at your desk. And you made a decision that you did not yet have a complete operational plan for, but that you understood with a clarity that was total and without ambiguity. You were going to document every single instance of misattribution from this day forward in a way that was legally, professionally, and forensically airtight. Not for a vague future confrontation, not to make yourself feel better. For a specific documentable record that would be coherent to any external party who needed to read it. You spent the weekend of April 11th and 12th building the documentation architecture. You thought about it the way you thought about a project scoping problem, which is to say you thought about what evidence a neutral third party would need to assess attribution accurately, what form that evidence needed to be in to be credible and verifiable, and how to create that evidence in a way that was both comprehensive and maintainable over time. You were not a lawyer. You did not have a background in employment law or documentary evidence, but you had spent 11 years in a profession built on the credibility of formal records, and you understood the difference between documentation that could be challenged and documentation that could not. The architecture you built had 3 components. The first was originals. Every document you created from April 9th forward was saved in 3 locations before it went anywhere near David. Your personal laptop drive with the original creation metadata intact, your personal email sent folder with the document attached so the timestamp lived in an external server record, and a printed copy placed in a physical binder that was kept at your home. You labeled every document in the file properties with your full name, your employee number, and the date of creation, which was a standard you had always applied professionally but now applied with the specific intention of generating a clear provenance record. The second component was the incident log. Every time a document was submitted to a client, presented internally, or filed on the shared drive with incorrect attribution, you created a log entry. Date, document title, names of people present if it was a meeting, how attribution was stated, and the specific discrepancy with your original. The third component was the metadata comparison record. When you found a shared drive version of your document with altered author information, you took screenshots of both versions, noted the creation date discrepancies, and saved them with a written description of the difference. These 3 components together produced something that a single component could not, a triangulated record. The original file proved creation, the incident log proved misattribution, the metadata comparison proved the alteration. Any one of these could be explained away individually. Together, they told a story that did not have an innocent reading. From April 9th to October 22nd, you documented 47 separate instances. Let me give you a sense of what that actually means. 15 of those 47 instances were formal deliverables submitted to clients or municipal bodies, documents that became part of the official Riverwalk project record with David Crane's name in the author field and in the covering letter, where yours should have been. That is 15 deliverables, some of them 40 and 50 pages long, representing hundreds of hours of your professional time, entered into the permanent record of a $47 million public project as the work of your director. 11 instances were internal presentations at Meridian senior leadership meetings where David described your analysis in the first person, attributing your conclusions and your recommendations to his own thinking. 9 were shared drive documents where the metadata had been altered from your original, 3 of which Melissa had modified within 48 hours of your submission. 7 were external communications, emails, and correspondence to city officials and funding bodies where David described your work in first person to external stakeholders who were forming professional judgments about Meridian based on the capabilities they believed David was demonstrating. 5 involved your performance-related documentation, your development plans and review notes where your contributions to specific work products were characterized in ways that minimized your technical role or attributed the insight to a team process rather than to your individual analysis. 47 instances, 6 months and 13 days, 212 pages in the physical binder at home. The binder had a second copy stored at your parents' house. You maintained your professional output through all of this at the same level you had maintained it since your first month. Because you were unaffected, which would be dishonest to say. The sustained experience of watching your work disappear into someone else's name was exhausting in a specific and unusual way, the way that things which require constant documentation rather than confrontation are exhausting, the work of maintaining precision when what you feel is the opposite of precision. But you maintained it because the documentation only worked if the work continued to be of a quality that could not be attributed to team effort or directorial guidance. The documentation required a clear and continuous single source. You were that source. The work had to prove it. The announcement that changed the timeline came from Kenneth Haig on an October morning, a week after you logged your 46th incident. Kenneth gathered the full staff for a brief all-hands meeting in the large conference room on floor 6, which Meridian used only for full staff events, and he announced that the firm was pursuing ISO Project Management Certification, a credential that would qualify Meridian for a class of federal government contracts it had been excluded from for years. Achieving ISO certification required an external audit of the firm's project management processes, documentation practices, and quality standards. The audit would be conducted by a firm called Northgate Advisory, a recognized ISO certification auditor. The audit would begin in approximately 6 weeks. It would cover all active major projects. The Riverwalk redevelopment project, as the firm's largest active engagement, would receive the most intensive review. You were in the back row of the conference room when Kenneth said this. You did not react visibly. You listened to the rest of the announcement. You returned to your desk. You sat for a moment. Then you found Northgate Advisory's contact information and composed an email to their project intake address. You said you were the senior project manager on the Riverwalk redevelopment project and that you had documentation relevant to the audit process that you believed the auditors needed to see before beginning their review. You asked for a preliminary meeting. You provided your contact information. You sent the email before David Crane arrived at the office. Northgate's response arrived within 2 days. A preliminary meeting was possible. They suggested a coffee shop close to the client's office. They asked you to bring any documentation you felt was relevant. You brought a printed copy of the binder and a USB drive with all digital originals and screenshots. Tricia Osei was the Northgate lead on the Meridian audit. She had been doing organizational performance reviews and ISO certification audits for 19 years, which you could tell from the first 30 minutes of your meeting because she read documents the way people read them when they have spent nearly 2 decades understanding what healthy and unhealthy organizational records look like from the inside. She read the metadata comparisons, she read the incident log, she read the dated originals against the shared drive versions. She read the conference biography. She was quiet in a way that was attentive rather than passive. When she finished the last page, she sat for about 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you, I need to ask you a few questions. The first one is whether you can be available during the audit period, and the second is whether you are prepared to have this documentation become part of the audit record." You said yes to both. She said, "Then we will begin." The Northgate audit started on November 3rd and ran for 5 business days. During those 5 days, you attended your normal schedule and did your normal work because you had learned over the past 6 months that the worst thing you could do was change your behavior in any way that might signal to David or Melissa that the nature of the situation had shifted. Patricia Osei and her associate worked from a temporary meeting room on floor 6 that the firm had provided for the audit. They reviewed documentation, they interviewed staff, they requested access to specific systems. On the third day, they requested access to the shared drive archives and the network server's backup system. This request had a specific implication that became clear later. Regional Memorial's IT infrastructure, like that of most firms its size, ran automated nightly backups of the network server with a rolling 12-month retention archive. Patricia had made the backup request before she asked for the active drive, which told you, once you understood it, that she already knew the active drive might not tell the complete story. The backup archive showed the creation history of every document that had ever been saved to the Meridian network. The original creation date, the original creating account, every subsequent modification, and who made it. It showed across the Riverwalk project files alone 73 documents with creation dates and account originations that matched your computer account and predated any involvement by David Crane's account. It showed 9 of those documents subsequently modified by Melissa Park's account to alter the author metadata. It showed a pattern that the active shared drive, which showed only the current version of each file, had been designed to conceal. On the 4th day of the audit, David Crane was called into a meeting with Kenneth Haig, Susan Park, and Patricia Osei. You were not in that meeting. You learned what happened in it from Kenneth the following morning. David had attempted 3 lines of argument. The first was that metadata was unreliable as an attribution measure because network systems introduced inconsistencies in how author information was recorded. Patricia had explained, with specific reference to the backup archive's consistency logs, why this argument did not apply to the evidence in front of them. The second was that document management practices in project-based firms often involve directors substantially reworking drafts before submission, and that the submitted version reflected the director's contribution even when the file's creation history showed an earlier origin. Patricia had pulled up the comparison between 11 of your original drafts and the final submitted versions and asked David to identify where his substantial rework was visible. He could not. He identified 1 paragraph in 1 report across 3 years of deliverables. 1 paragraph. His third argument was that you had been dissatisfied with your career development at the firm and that your motivation for raising attribution concerns was personal rather than factual. Patricia said that the evidence she had reviewed was documentary and that the motivations of the person who had brought the documentation to her attention were not relevant to its accuracy. Kenneth Haig had been sitting across the table from David Crane for this entire exchange. Kenneth had built Meridian over 22 years. He was 63 years old and had hired David Crane when David was 31, and he had watched David's career at the firm for the entirety of its duration. When David finished his 3rd attempt and the room was quiet, Kenneth looked at the backup archive printouts that Patricia had laid on the conference table, and then he looked at David, and there was a very long pause that Kenneth later described to you as the moment he understood not just what David had done but how long it had been happening. And then Kenneth Haig said the words that completed the loop that David himself had opened on the day he handed you the project binder 38 months earlier. He said, "We have been completely wrong about who the architect of this project is." The 48 hours after that meeting were administrative and consequential and almost entirely anticlimactic, which is how most real resolutions work. The drama, such as it is, had happened in the documentation phase, in the 6 months of quiet, precise, unobserved record keeping that had made the audit result possible. The Thursday was just the delivery. Kenneth met with you in the smaller conference room on floor 6 on that Thursday afternoon. He had the audit summary in front of him and your documentation binder, which Patricia had provided with your permission. He was direct without being performative about it. He said the audit had established clearly that the substantive authorship of the Riverwalk project's major deliverables resided with you and not with David Crane. He said this misattribution had been systematic and had persisted across the project's full duration. He said the firm was going to correct the record in its internal systems, its external project documentation, and its professional communications. He said he was sorry it had required an external audit to surface what should have been visible to leadership through the firm's ordinary operations. He said this with a specificity of self-accountability that you had not expected from him, and you let it sit in the room without filling it with reassurance, because some silences are not yours to close. David Crane was terminated that Thursday. His employment ended effective immediately. Security collected his badge at 2:47 p.m. Melissa Park was placed on a formal performance review for her role in the document organization, which Patricia's report characterized as materially contributing to the pattern of misattribution. Melissa was reassigned from her executive assistant position within the week. Robert Finch was placed on a performance improvement plan with specific reference to his failure to pursue the concern you had raised in good faith. You resigned 3 months later, which is the usual outcome when a performance improvement plan is designed around someone who already knows the institution well enough to understand when the trajectory is clear. The Riverwalk project's formal documentation was corrected. Your name was added to every major deliverable in Meridian's project records. The conference biography was retracted and replaced. The ISO certification submission that Northgate completed listed you as the principal contributor to the project management work that was being certified. Kenneth offered you David's directorship with a new title and compensation that reflected what you had already been doing rather than what your job description had said. You took 2 weeks to consider it, not because you were uncertain, but because you had learned from 6 months of documentation work that decisions worth making are worth taking seriously. You accepted on a Wednesday afternoon. David Crane put his name on 3 years of your work. Every proposal, every analysis, every win, none of it had your name on it. He was terminated on a Thursday in November. His security pass expired at 2:47 p.m. By Friday afternoon, Kenneth Haig had sent you a letter on Meridian letterhead with your name on it and a list of contributions that were accurately, formally, and permanently attributed to you for the first time since you had joined the firm. The letter did not apologize, it corrected the record. That is what was needed. The physical binder is in the fireproof box under the desk in your home office. You never brought it into the building. It did its work from 3 kilometers away. The Riverwalk corridor along the city's downtown waterfront is now open. It received a regional planning award the year after completion. The award citation names the principal contributors. Your name is on it. It was always supposed to be. These are the stories nobody planned to tell. That's why they feel the way they do.